WCHO.com. This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to Weekend Review for Monday, March 9th, 2020. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Our sponsor is the 2020 NCAA Frozen Four, starting 1 month from today, April 9th and 11th in Detroit, Michigan. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. What a crazy weekend of hockey, Jim. 4 leagues had their first round of playoffs, and the other 2 settled the playoff standings and who's going to have home ice. So why don't we just jump right in? ECAC, there was an upset in that league. 2 overtime games, but Princeton, who had only won 2 league games and 4 games overall this season, 2 overtime victories over Dartmouth, a big upset in that league. Every place else, the higher seed, the favored team won.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think going into this season, people had some expectations for Princeton. They were hoping that they'd be a pretty good team. They end up really having a dud of a season. But they were the ones that personified that when the postseason comes, everybody starts with a 0-0 record. They're now 2-0. And we're now talking about a Dartmouth team that we talked about Dartmouth a lot this year on this show about how strong they are and how they could be a real dark horse toward the end. They had a bad finish to the regular season. It carried over into the playoffs, and 2 overtime wins later, and Princeton's now heading to the ECAC quarterfinals to have the unenviable task of taking on Cornell. But still, good job for getting out of that series, after just such a miserable regular season. So hats off to Princeton. That's a very impressive start to their postseason.
And you can't have ECAC playoffs without overtime, and you can't have Union and Yale without multiple overtimes. That series went to 3 games and a double overtime, a 2-1 controversial win for Yale to advance.
Of course, that was the 3rd longest game of all time when those teams played back in 2006. That game went well into the early parts of a Saturday morning, if my memory serves me right. And that game was the 3rd longest game of all time. This game ended much sooner. A 4:00 start. I was saying that it could easily be a game that'll end after all the 7:00 games that were played last night. But it was somewhere around the early parts of the second overtime that Union, which hadn't really had any offense through the 3rd period in overtime, just 1 shot in the first overtime period, they get a rush. They come down, scores what looks to be the game-winning goal. Referee on the ice immediately waves it off for goaltender interference. They go in after an 8-minute review. They find that the call on the ice was going to stand. I'm not sure that I agree with it. I actually thought that there was some contact with the goalie, but there was also some contact by the Yale player pushing the Union player toward the goaltender. Whatever it might be, it didn't even take 2 minutes later. Yale comes down the other end. They score the game-winning goal. It's over. We weren't going 5 overtimes last night. But still, another double overtime game between those 2 teams. They play some classics in the postseason. And for a Game 3, you always love a Game 3 that can go into a double overtime, too. That's always one of my favorites.
Well, that'll set up Yale at Quinnipiac. You mentioned Princeton at Cornell. Clarkson will host Colgate, who prevailed in their series over Brown. And Harvard is at RPI. They're going to play in what I can only imagine will be a very spooky, empty Houston Fieldhouse. And we'll get to that coronavirus issue a little bit later in the podcast. But that sets up some pretty good stuff. You got to think things are really well set up. If those top 4 seeds end up advancing to the semifinals, RPI, Quinnipiac, Clarkson, and Cornell, that sounds like a terrific Final Four.
It certainly does. When we saw this playoff bracket lay itself out, that was something we thought. But there's some, even if a team like Harvard's able to get there, that would be an interesting one. And I don't expect it to happen, but if Princeton were to take Cornell out, I think it would be the 2nd year in a row they'd eliminate them for the playoffs. Maybe it's the 2nd time in 3 years. But that would be another interesting possibility as well.
Well, we turn also out east in playoff action in Atlantic hockey. with an 11-team league and all 11 teams making the postseason. The first round has the bottom 6 teams playing down to 3, while the top 5 have a weekend off. And it's been years. I don't even know. I haven't looked it up, and probably nobody would care, but it has certainly been many, many years since all of the top seeds in the first round in Atlantic hockey have gone on to the next round. Bentley had a pretty easy time with Canisius on Friday night. The game was close, a late power play goal by Rainer Gorowski, who had a hat trick in the game, advanced Bentley. Mercyhurst didn't have a very good time out at Air Force, easy for the Falcons. And Robert Morris and Holy Cross went to a 3-game series. It was a shutout on Friday for Holy Cross's Matt Radomski, a late empty net goal, a 2-0 win. Robert Morris, in exciting fashion, won 2-1 in overtime on Saturday, setting up Sunday's game. But by the third period, it became a blowout for Robert Morris, a shutout for Justin Kapelmaster, spoiled with a couple minutes left, a 5-1 win for Holy Cross. So nothing too surprising out of that league, except that there weren't any surprises.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Robert Morris series, the Colonials and Derek Schooley may have to feel that they, kind of saved their season from the grave, because you're talking about, a Saturday night in overtime where if you let one puck in the net, series is over, season's over. And instead you find a way to win in the overtime period and then come back and pretty much dominate a game from start to finish. I mean, Robert Morris took a 5-0 lead in that game in the third period. That was a very solid effort on the final night of that series. But you're right, everything else kind of business as usual. Bentley, a tight game on Saturday, and an exciting one. I'm sure that one was good for the fans and good for the players to play. And Air Force, listen, they held serve. I know that Frank Serratori was confident in his team going into the weekend, and this has been a tough season for Mercyhurst, a really tough one for Rick Gotkin to have. But I think they've got 3 good teams advancing. You've got all 8 seeds, all the top 8 seeds playing in the next round of the playoffs. I think it's going to be a good quarterfinal for Atlantic hockey.
Well, that sets up the next round, the quarterfinal round. Robert Morris has been to the Final Four in Atlantic hockey 6 years in a row. They're looking for their 7th. That'll be at Sacred Heart. That's a Thursday, Friday, Sunday series at Webster Bank Arena. And then Bentley will be at AIC. Those are 1 p.m. games on Friday and Saturday. And if there's a third game on Sunday, they don't even know what time that'll be yet. Niagara, they already knew they were going to Army West Point. Air Force goes back to RAT, where they finished the season 2 weeks ago. So those are some great matchups in that league coming up. I would not be surprised to see an upset or 2 out of that, but it also would not be shocking to see the top teams prevail. If I was looking for an upset, the one team I would look at is Niagara. They've been up and down this season, but they have been just terrific during the last little bit of the season and managed to get that 5th seed through some good play late. So that might be a 3-game series, and who knows? You might see Niagara make it back to Buffalo for a 2nd straight year.
I think that's a very well-coached Niagara team, and that's a big part of it. They seem to know – I've known Jason Lammers for a long time, and he gets his teams to play their best as the season progresses. And you saw it even down the stretch. I thought they had some good, decent performances at times in the second half in games where they should have been outmatched. And I think that you're right. That might be the big dark horse performance to look for next weekend in Atlantic hockey.
In the Big Ten, Michigan took 2 from Michigan State, their arch rivals, 3-0 wins both nights. Notre Dame won on Friday night, 1-0 at Minnesota. The Gophers came back on Saturday, a 2-1 win, and then that set up on Sunday a big game 3, Minnesota hanging on for the 3-2 win there. And then at Ohio State, a 9-1 win over Wisconsin on Friday, and a 2-1 overtime win by the Buckeyes on Saturday. Let's start with that series. Wisconsin had taken 5 of 6 points against Ohio State to end the season. You got to feel like the Buckeyes were really out to make a statement. But really what comes out of that series and the end of the season for Wisconsin is just how thoroughly disappointing this campaign has been for a talent-laden Badgers.
I would think so. This was not the season that Tony Granato and his staff wanted. They had some high expectations, I think, on their shoulders, and had some good performances early even. I think of them coming out and just handing it to Boston College, in a single game non-conference matchup, and everything from there just never seemed to go in the right direction. They didn't play the hockey that I think that they wanted to play for much of the season, and sometimes that's what happens. You have a team full of some really young superstar players. A lot of individuals that are great don't always make a great team. And we'll see where that goes for next year in terms of who's back and who's not. But it was definitely a difficult season. And in terms of Ohio State, I think maybe the best thing that happened to them was losing 5 out of 6 points the weekend before, because I think, if anything, it just refocused them, made them realize, hey, there's no pushovers come the playoffs. We don't play well. We could not only, be done in the Big Ten playoffs. It was so volatile in the pairwise, they could have slipped far enough. You never know what could have happened. So I think that there was a clear message that Steve Rollick had his team laser focused and able to come out, win that series, and did so, like you mentioned, on Friday in such dominating fashion.
And you got to wonder for Wisconsin, you mentioned who's going to be back. Montreal's already talked about Cole Caulfield playing another season with the Badgers, and some have also speculated American Hockey League. Alex Turcotte, are the Kings going to sign him? Keandre Miller, the sophomore defenseman, is a Rangers draft pick, a first-round draft pick. Those are three guys who the Badgers could lose. They could see some other signings as well. And, some people have been asking, is Tony Granato in danger? It's been an underperforming season, but it's been a Wisconsin program that has been turning about the battleship, and you can't always turn things around in 1 or 2 or 3 years. So we'll see what happens there. Talking about disappointing seasons, Jeff Jackson looked thoroughly dejected. He's very emotionless on the bench, but looked really downtrodden at the end of that game. And that has to have been a very difficult season. A team that started out 7-0-1 and up to third in the USCHO.com men's Division I ice hockey poll, and getting some first place votes, that just plummeted after the mid part of the season. And just, they're eliminated. There's no way they're going to get in as an at-large. Very disappointing for the Fighting Irish this season.
Yeah, they got to the number 3 in the poll on November 19th, and I went back and looked. After that, from that point in the season on, there were 7, 14, and 6. That just doesn't seem to equate with Notre Dame. This is a team that year in, year out, especially of late, has been strong, powerhouse-like team. They got to the Frozen Four back-to-back years and were playing some great hockey, and here it is. They just can't seem to put things together in the second half. And I'm curious to see, if anything comes of this. It's not likely. I think that people at Notre Dame are pretty patient with a great coach they have in Jeff Jackson. But you're right. He had some signs of frustration in the third period last night. His team had been called for 2 penalties at once in the second period, a minor and then something that was reviewed by video and was deemed a major. I actually didn't even think it should have been a penalty, but whatever the case may be, they end up giving that. That's what leads to Minnesota's third goal. And then in the third period, you ended up with a similar situation where there was a reviewed hit. They called a minor, and I've never seen Jeff Jackson just lose it on the bench. And the expletives that you could read easily from his lips were clear. It shows the emotion. He's upset. It's been a tough season and definitely a tough ending.
And a tough season for Notre Dame means they end with a 500 record. So it's not like they completely collapsed. They just didn't achieve what people and they also thought they should achieve. Just quickly before we go to a break, Michigan, boy, Mel Pearson's got the Wolverines playing great.
I think they're dangerous right now. They might be the most dangerous team in that league, and I know you're into a single elimination situation now, so that plays to both sides of this. But they walk into Michigan State. Don't forget how many weeks did we talk about Michigan State being this great team, and they were going to be the team to watch. They get whitewashed 6-0 over the course of the weekend, 3-0 back-to-back games. And Michigan's doing it right now. They're getting good goaltending, they're playing good defense, and they're scoring timely goals. And that's the formula. And this has not been an easy season at Michigan. Mel Pearson, though, he's actually put his team in a position that if they win one more game, they're probably going to lock up an NCAA spot. That's how close they are right now. They're inside the cut line. And I think that this is a great story. We both love Mel Pearson. He's a great guy. We enjoy talking to him every time we do. And you can see that his team has put together the best season at the right time.
So that sets up 2 single elimination on-campus semifinal games. Minnesota's at Penn State on Saturday, Michigan at Ohio State on Sunday. Boy, the atmosphere at Ohio State really wasn't there. It sold fewer than 2,000 tickets, fewer than 1,000 in the building probably. Again, maybe spring break, coronavirus fears, maybe lack of interest in the matchup. Who knows? Attendance in some of these playoff games has been tough. But those games are coming up next weekend. We're going to take a pause, and we'll get back to the WCHA playoffs, plus the end of the seasons in Hockey East and the NCHC, and a couple of other news items in just a bit. This podcast is sponsored by the NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Every time you show up, every time you make your presence heard, whether you clap your hands or stomp your feet, lead the chant or join the chorus. However you choose to be a fan, you make the game. The NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 to get your tickets today.
Continuing with Weekend Review from USCHO.com, I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. In the WCHA, that was the only conference with a couple of lower seeds beating the upper seeds. Bowling Green swept 2 games at Alaska, 4-2 and 3-2. And Michigan Tech and Northern Michigan, 2 longtime arch rivals. It took triple overtime on Saturday night for Tech to sweep the 2 games at Northern Michigan. The other 2 games, Bemidji State took care of business in 3 games with Lake State, and Alaska Anchorage was blown out on Friday and defeated on Saturday for Minnesota State to advance. But let's hit those ones that were really interesting with lower seeds. And I want to start with Michigan Tech and Northern Michigan. Great games, and those overtime periods on Saturday night were something else.
Yeah, it ends up being the 17th longest game, men's NCAA Division I game of all time. And listen, neither team was conceding in overtime. There was some great goaltending on both ends, and getting to listen to little bits of it. The stream was cutting in and out for me, but certainly had its dramatic flair and in a great environment. And that you get credit that to Northern. They put it, we talk about some of these buildings that didn't put in good crowds. They had probably the best crowd of the weekend, up there in Northern Michigan, and that's credit to their fans. But it's a good rivalry when you can put a nice rivalry in a building like that in a quarterfinal type of setting. That's what it's all about. And I think actually we'll probably see some good environments going forward. That's what I do like about the WCHA playoffs, playing the entire thing in home ice. And these are schools, I know this is a league that's kind of disintegrating before our eyes, but these are schools where you have a lot of passionate fan bases that'll pack them into some smaller barns, and it creates a great atmosphere for the players. So they had that in spades this weekend for that playoff series, and hats off to Michigan Tech. Always seems to be a good postseason team in the WCHA playoffs. Whether they win it or not, they always seem to get themselves into those positions to be a pretty strong contender in these playoffs.
Bowling Green really had a downturn in the latter part of the season. They seem to have turned things around a little bit. Swept at Alaska, now they get to go on to play Bemidji. These are key matchups for both teams. Bemidji right now is number 12 in the pairwise. They had dropped below the bubble after the loss to Lake Superior State on Saturday, came back up to number 12. That's an iffy position for them even being at number 12 in the pairwise, it's kind of must-win time for Bemidji, or at least 2 out of the 3, and it certainly is must-win for Bowling Green going forward. On the other half of that matchup, Michigan Tech at Minnesota State, you got to think that the Mavericks are going to be the heavy favorites in that. But Michigan Tech is playing some very good hockey right now.
Yes, I mean, certainly. We obviously just mentioned that, but I look at Bemidji, and you mentioned that the fluidity of the pairwise this weekend and just how volatile it was around the bubble. They began last weekend as 10 in the pairwise, and you could look at the RPIs and say, okay, it's kind of close, 10, 11, 12, they're kind of close. You didn't know how bad one loss to Lake State could take you down after winning on Friday. So you win the first game, you lose that second game, you drop down to 13, and know that if you lose again on Sunday in game 3, their season was over. They would not have had a chance. They would have been out. So it's remarkable how everything from really at this point somewhere around 10 down to all the way down to probably 20 in the pairwise. There's so much fluctuation that'll happen. We saw it. That was a good example of it. But nice job. They found a way to pull that game out on Sunday. Took a 2-0 lead early. I think that helped them get the confidence going. And of course, Lake State pushes back. They score a really early third period goal, and then Bemidji gets the icing on the cake in the third. And I thought that was a team that we all knew was playing their best hockey going into this postseason. So imagine if they had been knocked out. That was one I wasn't expecting, but a nice run. And then the other one you mentioned, Bowling Green. That was an unenviable situation where they lost down the stretch, ended up having to go on the road. And when you find out you're heading on the road in the playoffs, you're not thinking about hopping on a plane and going to Fairbanks. And that's exactly what they had to do. They go in, take care of business, a great job there. You got to be pleased with your team if you can go on to the road and make it a long trip and still come out with the sweep.
Well, let's go to the 2 leagues that finished up their regular season this past weekend. In Hockey East, we thought it might go down to Saturday, but really things were mostly decided on Friday after New Hampshire lost to Boston College. But a good weekend for teams to settle things. A good end of the season for New Hampshire to get the tie with BC on Saturday, although it was pretty much a meaningless game. Northeastern, with the loss by New Hampshire on Friday, sort of quote-unquote backed into the playoffs, even though they had lost to BU that night, came back to win at Boston University on Saturday. Lowell and Maine also prevailed on Friday. So that really settles things in Hockey East. It was a crazy last couple of weeks, but almost kind of just sort of happened and fell into place on Friday night.
Yeah, in Northeastern, I mean, they technically didn't really back in, because if they had lost on Saturday and New Hampshire had won, they actually would have missed the playoffs. So they had to actually go and do something. The strange thing, of course, is the start times. They played this at 4 o'clock game. They were done at 6:30 before New Hampshire hops on the ice. They've won, so New Hampshire knew their season was over at that point and made that game a little meaningless. But as you mentioned, good for New Hampshire. That's a very good team that's not going to play in the postseason. It's why coaches in Hockey East, some of them still advocate for we should probably let just every team in, because we've seen it this year. We've got good teams that are missing the playoffs, New Hampshire being one of them. And Merrimack was in Vermont were both pretty hot down the stretch. So it's kind of interesting to see the 3 teams that missed it all had some redeeming qualities to them down the stretch. But what it sets up is one of the strangest situations I've ever seen, where the number 1 and the number 2 teams in the playoffs next week in Hockey East will play nationally ranked opponents in Northeastern and Providence. BC gets Providence, Massachusetts gets Northeastern. And then the teams in the middle, UMass Lowell, they'll play BU, Maine will play Connecticut. Connecticut and BU, they're not ranked, really haven't been ranked at all this season. It's just interesting to see that the teams that are going to conceivably, according to the pollsters, are the toughest teams are the ones that are going to be playing number 1 and number 2.
Well, this is where some of the pundits and cranks and trolls will point out, well, the only thing that matters is pairwise, and indeed that is probably the case. It's certainly the case when you get to the end of the season, but the polls and the pairwise tend to converge as you get here. But Maine hosting UConn coming up this weekend is also interesting. And BU at Lowell. Lowell should be able to hang on with that, but BU has shown some good play in fits and spurts this season too. So it should be a pretty entertaining first round. It would not be surprising to see the top seeds prevail, but there are some teams that can make some noise. UConn and Providence, I'm looking at you.
There's no doubt. I mean, UConn certainly against Maine. Down the stretch, Maine, as hot as they were, the one team that gave them trouble was UConn. I believe they beat them twice, and I think Maine in the other game had to use overtime to win at home. In Providence, gosh, I mean, they've been a hard team to figure out. Obviously, they got a win against Maine last weekend, and then lost this weekend at home against in Orono and. I'm sorry, up in Orono, they lost, and they've been hard to figure out, but they have enough talent. You've got the leading scorer in the league in Jack Dugan. You have one of the best goal scorers in Tice Thompson on that team. And it's not like they're playing injured or they're injured that I know of. So I mean, it just hasn't been consistent for Providence throughout this entire season, and they'll play BC, who is, listen, they're red hot going into the playoffs. I believe that they should be able to take care of business. The one series that I actually have the biggest concern about is BU and Lowell, because these two teams, this will be the fifth time in 8 years they square off in the postseason. Last year, Lowell had home ice. The series went to 3 games, and BU routed them in game 3. So that's a really tight series. Lowell loses the season series to them 0-1-2. BU had the only win, and there were 2 ties, but that's a very content. I think really all 4 series are going to be neck and neck. I don't think that it's going to be easy for me to pick. And if all 4 win 3 games, I would not be surprised.
Back to Providence for one moment. Nate Lehman has talked about building teams for the postseason, and certainly Providence should be well suited for that. This is a good time for them to say, okay, regular season is done. It's a new second season. Let's just refocus. You
have to rip the page, tear it off the calendar, whatever you have to do. Find something symbolic to just tell the guys everything's over. The past is the past. We're now playing for the future, and there's nothing you can do to control the past. And there was some big hiccups down the stretch. You think of losing to Merrimack. You think of not getting that win on the last night of the regular season that, maybe could have helped you propel a little higher into the standings. It was a tough stretch for Providence to end their season. And I think that they'd love some games back, but at the same time, they played some tight games that they just didn't get over the hump on. That's one of those things where you take some frustration. You tied Vermont, a 1-1 tie where you just couldn't score goals despite the fact that you had a ton of shots. I mentioned the sweep against Merrimack, just couldn't get anything really going. So I just think that if the offense can come alive, and this is a team that their offense, when it's good, it's good. You think of the opening night of the season, a 7-0 win over Maine. Boy, has that changed for both of those teams. But they've had some big offensive outputs this year. 6 against St. Lawrence, 6 against Boston College, 6 against Boston University. They've been putting up numbers on the scoreboard. So when their offense comes alive, watch out.
Let's turn to the NCHC. Just about everything was settled on Friday except the Penrose Cup. And the reason for that is Omaha beat North Dakota 4-1 at home at Baxter Arena. Omaha had taken a game back in January at North Dakota. So they beat North Dakota twice, something nobody else in the league has managed to do, if I am remembering correctly. And that left things open for Minnesota Duluth with a sweep and a loss by North Dakota on Saturday to grab a share of the Penrose Cup. North Dakota came back in big fashion, 5-0 win over Omaha, and they are the sole possessors of the Penrose Cup.
And something that a lot of people might not have been aware of. The cup was presented last week at North Dakota when they won and they clinched the share of the cup. That made sense, and it would have been presented again on Saturday to Minnesota Duluth if they had indeed been if they had won and North Dakota lost. So, but had those teams tied, Minnesota Duluth actually would have had the top seed in the playoffs. They had the tiebreaker after splitting the season series. They had the most wins. So interestingly, that was something that was on the line that not a lot of people realize. I think a lot of people just kind of saw North Dakota take that trophy a week ago and said, oh, they must be the number one seed. So good job by them. They finally are able to clinch it on the last night of the regular season. But not a lot else to really sort out in that league. There was a question whether, Western Michigan would get home ice. They took care of business. They're going to have home ice. But everything else was pretty much settled, and it sets up some, playoff matchups with probably the four best teams in the NCHC are the four home teams, and the four teams that are on the bottom, they're all good teams, but I think they've got really big efforts, yeoman efforts ahead of them. The one thing I will point out is that Colorado College, they'll go on the road, obviously, as the 8th seed and take on North Dakota. Colorado College is a better road team than they are a home team. Just 4 wins at home, 7 wins on the road this season. So I don't know if that'll factor in at all. I still think that they could get just shellacked, but they do seem to play a little bit better away from home.
One other thing to mention in the NCHC, an injury over the weekend to Jordan Kawaguchi has him out, from what I understand, upper body injury. Some concerns there for North Dakota as they go into action next weekend in the first round of the playoffs, but also maybe a concern some folks were wondering about with the Hobie Baker Award. I don't think that's going to be a big concern. He has contributed so much to the team along the way. Even if he missed some time with the injury, I would have to think that the Hobie voters have got to have him solidly in their top 2 or 3.
I think you're right about that. I think that he's obviously still top 10. He probably still gets into the top 3. The only thing I worry about is whether it maybe impacts whether he wins the award, because if say he doesn't play another game and you have somebody that's, in there like a John Leonard or there's a number of different players, even Dryden McKay goes off and just has an unbelievable postseason, gives up, 2 goals to the regionals when the vote is taken, and suddenly you're thinking about that. I just think that if he doesn't get to back on the ice, he can't contribute on the time when everybody's watching, and that could lead some voters astray a little bit. I still, you've been on this committee. I'm on it again this year. We have a call. You discuss each candidate, and then each voter goes off and votes. So it depends. I think that you'll hear a lot from the NCHC in terms of the people that watch that league really supporting his candidacy, and that's really what you need the most.
And I think it's a big deal this year because there's really no clear-cut front runner. Last year, Cale Makar, everybody knew that he was going to be the guy. I don't think there was much controversy with that. So little bits like this do impact it, and as the voters get involved, I think it's a committee of 27, some number about like that. Coaches, writers, scouts, even an official from each league involved. So a pretty good cross-section of people that see a lot of hockey. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll follow that over the next couple of weeks. 2 quick news items before we move on. Actually, one is not so much news, but statistics. The pairwise. Arizona State now sitting in 13th place. They're better than a 90% lock to get in. And I guess if it's 90%, it's not a lock, but some things could happen. One that I think we have to watch out for is teams like Michigan and Maine, who may be able to creep up, whether Bemidji can hold serve or whether they fall below Arizona State. But the other part of it is the cut line, the Mendoza line. Right now it's at 15. Whoever's the Atlantic Hockey champion will take the 16th seed in, it could be the 16th seed, but it could be the 15th seed, but they're the 16th position. So only 15 positions left right now. And there are a lot of teams below that cut line that could have an impact in their league playoffs that could put that into play. So still a very strong position for Arizona State, but not yet locked up.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked about the strength of Hockey East, and any of the bottom 4 teams, if they were to win Hockey East championship, would then move that cut line up one. The same can probably be said for Minnesota, although Minnesota probably clinches a spot, somewhere in the top 15. So you're not really moving the cut line per se, but it's still teams that are not in that top 16 right now or top 15 that would be threatening to the teams that are between 13, 14, and 15. And as you mentioned, Maine and Michigan, they're still playing games. They're below Arizona State, but inside the cut line. And if they are to have some success here, go on a little bit of a run, move up, that pushes Arizona State down. If they get into a position where they are the number 15 team, all you need is one upset somewhere. All you need is a team like Boston University to win the Hockey East Championship, and we're talking about a scenario that would knock Arizona State out.
Well, one last item. It's a news item beyond hockey, certainly, and of significant importance, and that's the COVID-19 coronavirus situation. And we've been wondering what that would do to postseason games, NCAA games. With a couple of cases in the Albany, New York area, Rensselaer announced just after 1 p.m. on Sunday that the games between it and Harvard next weekend in the ECAC quarterfinals will be played without any fans in attendance at Houston Fieldhouse, a cavernous facility. And it's going to be very strange, I'm sure, to hear just the skates and whistles echoing through that building. I don't think either of us are in a position to say whether that's an overreaction or not. I've read some things that talk about how the disease can spread and multiply, and how it can spread much more quickly when you get a whole bunch of people together in a building. So a precaution being taken. My question on this, and my concern, I guess, is whether this is just the first of many places where this will happen.
I mean, it could be. And I know you said we're not in a position to say if it's an overreaction. I'm going to say I think it's a little bit of an overreaction. I really do. I mean, you're talking about a pretty broad area there in the metropolitan Albany area that, I mean, a couple of weeks from now, you're going to have an NCAA regional there. What are you supposed to do then? Are we going to play the entire NCAA regional with no fans in the building? I mean, you're literally talking 10 miles away from each other, these two buildings, and obviously the Times Union Center, a bigger building than it is the Houston Fieldhouse. So it kind of puts everything into perspective, certainly, but it also makes you wonder, are we going to lengths that are a little bit too extreme? I understand this is a disease that you'd love to keep somewhat contained, but there's too many opportunities. I mean, listen, how many people were going to go to this game anyways? And I'm not trying to put down RPI, but let's look at where attendances were last weekend. And some places putting in 800-900 fans, and were there going to be much more than 1,000, 1,500 fans at RPI? I mean, you've got religious places of worship that put in more than that in a given weekend. They're not being told that they can't have crowds. So I just don't know where this is going to go in the long run. It is obviously a time of year that's going to be tense for the NCAA, because you don't just have hockey coming up, you have much larger gatherings for college basketball on the men's and women's side. So we're going to have to keep an eye on it, but I just hope that people don't overreact here. And obviously we want to see this slow down here in the United States and globally, but we have to still go about our day-to-day lives and not live in too much fear.
Yeah, I agree with you on not living in fear. I will point out one thing. Out in the Seattle area, where they have a lot more cases, they have shut down worship services and having people stay at home to work. If in a couple of weeks the Albany area has gone from a couple of cases to 100 cases, then we have a very different animal. We'll have to see what the NCAA does for that regional and other regionals, all three of them anyway, around medium to larger metropolitan areas where there could be a concentration of people who are ill. Anyway, we can only speculate at this point, and so we will stop right there with the speculation and wrap up this podcast. This episode has been sponsored by the 2020 NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we will catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review Podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.